Imagine discovering a document that contradicts everything historians claim about the medieval period. Picture holding evidence that suggests our textbooks have systematically omitted an empire larger than any European kingdom. This isn't theoretical. Such a text actually exists. The document in question dates to 1357 and bears the name of its alleged author, Sir John Mandeville, a knight who supposedly traversed the known world and returned with accounts that baffle modern scholars. Academics typically categorize this work as medieval fiction, a collection of tall tales unworthy of serious historical consideration. Yet dismissing it outright requires ignoring some uncomfortable facts. This text predates many historical sources we accept without question. It was composed before the standardization of European geography, before explorers like Columbus set sail, before the age when Western powers began systematically documenting the world according to their interests. The manuscript's age alone demands attention. It originates from an era when travel literature served practical purposes, not entertainment. What makes this document particularly striking is its tone. The author doesn't write like someone inventing stories around a campfire. The prose reads like administrative documentation, a bureaucratic record of places visited and conditions observed. Distances appear as precise measurements. Landmarks receive detailed physical descriptions. Political structures are explained with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone reporting to a superior. Consider what happens when we actually read this text without dismissing it preemptively. The world it describes bears little resemblance to the medieval period we learn about in school. Instead of isolated feudal territories barely aware of lands beyond their borders, we encounter a globe crisscrossed with trade networks, populated by diverse societies, and dominated by powers whose very names have somehow vanished from our collective memory. The manuscript mentions a spring with remarkable properties, water that shifts in flavor throughout the day, capable of healing ailments after just 3 drinks. Modern readers immediately categorize this as mythology, but the author presents it as simple geography, a notable landmark along a well-traveled route. No dramatic build-up, no supernatural framing, just factual notation. Then there are the creatures. The text describes beings we've relegated to heraldic symbols and fantasy literature. Massive raptors strong enough to carry horses skyward. Hybrid animals combining features of multiple species. Organisms that seem biologically impossible by contemporary standards. Yet again, the descriptive style remains clinical rather than sensationalistic. The author catalogs these creatures the way a naturalist might document wildlife, noting their behaviors, habitats, and interactions with human populations. The manuscript also discusses human populations that don't fit our anthropological models. Groups with unusual physical characteristics inhabiting remote regions. Giants of extraordinary height dwelling on distant islands. Communities speaking languages that suggest isolation spanning millennia. Modern science insists such populations never existed, yet the author describes them with the same straightforward tone used for everything else. But the most significant element isn't the exotic details, it's the political geography. The text describes a massive empire called Tartaria, with its provincial heart in a land named Cath. This empire supposedly rivaled or exceeded every European power in wealth, military strength, and territorial extent. The author claims to have personally served in this empire's forces, not briefly, but for over a year, experiencing its institutions firsthand. Here's where things become genuinely puzzling. If we consult medieval maps, we actually find this empire depicted, not vaguely or ambiguously, but prominently, sprawling across vast swaths of Asia with clearly marked borders and labeled provinces. Early cartographers weren't sketching fantasy realms. They believed they were documenting real political entities based on the best information available. So we face a paradox. A medieval manuscript describes a world-dominating empire with specificity suggesting direct observation. Contemporary maps corroborate this empire's existence. Yet modern history maintains that no such civilization existed, treating both the manuscript and the maps as collective delusion or misunderstanding. The inconsistency demands investigation. Either medieval Europeans were remarkably confused about basic geography despite successfully navigating trade routes across continents, or something fundamental has been omitted from the historical narrative we've inherited. This manuscript represents more than a historical curiosity. It's potentially evidence of deliberate historical revision, a window into a past that powerful interests may have worked to obscure. Every page raises questions about who writes history, who controls which narratives survive, and what truths might have been systematically eliminated. The journey ahead requires examining not just what this document says, but what its very existence implies about the construction of historical knowledge itself. To understand the significance of what the 1357 manuscript describes, we need to establish what mainstream history tells us about this period. The official narrative presents the 14th century as a time of limited horizons and fragmented power. According to standard historical accounts, medieval Europe consisted of relatively small kingdoms focused primarily on regional concerns. The Black Death had recently devastated populations. The 100 Years' War consumed England and France. Trade with Asia existed but remained minimal and difficult, conducted along dangerous routes by hardy merchants willing to risk their lives for profit. In this version of events, Asian powers like the Chinese dynasties existed in relative isolation, occasionally interacting with the West, but never dominating global affairs to the extent European empires later would. The Mongol invasions had occurred but were treated as temporary disruptions rather than evidence of sustained continental organization. This narrative presents medieval knowledge of distant lands as fragmentary and often fictional. Europeans supposedly possessed little accurate information about Asia's interior, relying on second-hand accounts, religious legends, and pure speculation. Maps from this era are considered unreliable at best, mixing real geography with imaginary territories. But Mandeville's account contradicts this picture fundamentally. He describes a world where long-distance travel wasn't exceptional, but routine, where political powers extended across thousands of miles with functioning administrative systems, where trade networks operated at a scale historians claim didn't exist for centuries. The manuscript's geographical details deserve particular attention. When describing the land of Cathay and its relation to China, the author insists repeatedly that these are distinct territories. Cathay lies adjacent to China but constitutes a separate political entity, serving as the central province of the greater Tartarian Empire. China, in this telling, occupies a peripheral position relative to the true center of Asian power. Modern historians dismiss this distinction as confusion. They claim Cathay was simply a medieval European misunderstanding of China, two names for the same place. But this explanation requires assuming the author was profoundly confused about geography he claimed to have experienced personally. It requires believing that someone who allegedly spent over a year serving in a government somehow couldn't distinguish between neighboring countries. Moreover, when we examine medieval maps predating later European colonial expansion, we consistently find Cathay and China marked as separate regions. Multiple cartographers working independently across different decades and nations all made this same mistake. At what point does repeated consistency stop being error and start being evidence? The economic details in the manuscript pose similar problems for the official narrative. The text describes Cathay using a currency system based on treated leather rather than metal coinage. Gold and silver weren't used for money, but for construction and decoration, a complete inversion of European economic assumptions. This detail is either pure invention or observation of an actual alternative economic system. If invented, why choose something so strange and counterintuitive? Medieval fantasists typically projected their own economic models onto imaginary lands. The specificity and strangeness of this monetary system suggests the author was describing something real that didn't fit familiar patterns. The manuscript also describes architectural splendor exceeding anything in Europe. Buildings with gold-covered floors, palaces of enormous scale, infrastructure suggesting wealth and organizational capacity beyond what the official timeline acknowledges any Asian power possessing during this period. Again, we face a choice. Either this represents wild exaggeration by someone who never left Europe, or it documents a civilization whose achievements have been systematically minimized in subsequent historical accounts. Perhaps most tellingly, the manuscript places this vast empire not in the ancient past, but in the present tense of 1357. The author doesn't describe ruins or legends. He describes a functioning political entity, currently operating, which he personally interacted with. This transforms the text from mythology.
When we examine the manuscript's specific claims, we encounter details that seem to violate what we know about medieval reality. Taken individually, these elements appear fantastical, but examining them collectively reveals patterns that deserve serious consideration. Start with the healing spring near Mount Palumbe. The text describes water that changes taste hourly, sometimes resembling cinnamon, other times cloves or other spices. 3 drinks allegedly cure any illness. Modern readers immediately classify this as magical thinking. But consider the author's presentation. He doesn't frame this as miraculous or supernatural. It's described as a known landmark, a geographical feature travelers would recognize. The matter-of-fact tone suggests the author expected readers to accept this as natural, if unusual, phenomenon. Could this represent misunderstood natural processes? Certain mineral springs do have distinctive tastes that vary with temperature, time of day, or seasonal factors. Various minerals possess genuine medicinal properties. While the specific claims may be exaggerated, the underlying description might reflect observation of real springs with unusual characteristics. The fauna presents a greater challenge. The manuscript describes griffins, creatures with features of both eagles and lions, not as mythological symbols, but as actual predators. It claims they possess extraordinary strength, capable of lifting horses into flight. Their bones supposedly made excellent bow materials, prized for their strength. Similarly, the text mentions birds of prey large enough to carry off substantial animals, creatures that seem biologically impossible by modern standards. Yet, megafauna did exist in various historical periods. Birds significantly larger than modern species have been documented through fossil evidence. Could the manuscript be recording species that existed into the medieval period but are now extinct? The human populations described pose equally difficult questions. The manuscript mentions groups with distinctive physical characteristics, horned individuals, giants ranging from 30 to 50 feet tall. These descriptions seem obviously mythological to contemporary readers, but nearly every ancient culture worldwide includes accounts of giant beings, from the Nephilim in Hebrew texts to the Jotnar in Norse mythology, to Native American legends of huge ancestors. These stories appear globally with suspicious consistency. Either every culture independently invented similar myths, or these accounts preserve memories of something real that no longer exists. The manuscript's author demonstrates notable caution when discussing the largest giants. He states clearly that he avoided regions where they reportedly dwelt, as travelers to those areas never returned. This admission of limited first-hand knowledge actually strengthens credibility. A pure fantasist would claim to have seen everything. The most geopolitically significant impossibility involves the imprisonment of entire populations behind mountains. The text describes how Alexander the Great, during his campaigns, encountered tribes so numerous and dangerous that he supposedly called upon divine intervention to seal them behind mountain ranges that closed like gates. These imprisoned peoples, identified through biblical names Gog and Magog, allegedly remained isolated into the 14th century, speaking only ancient Hebrew because they had no contact with linguistic evolution elsewhere. A specific mountain pass called Clarin remained unsealed, guarded by warriors to prevent escape. Modern historians treat this as pure religious allegory. The names Gog and Magog appear in apocalyptic biblical prophecy, so the story must be theological fiction, not historical account. But the manuscript presents detailed geographical information, specific mountain ranges near the Caspian Sea, named passes, established guard posts. Why would pure allegory require such geographical precision? Moreover, multiple independent traditions reference sealed populations in Central Asian mountains. Hebrew texts mention it. Greek sources include versions. Islamic eschatology contains parallel accounts. When diverse cultural traditions share specific geographical claims, dismissing all of them as coincidental fiction becomes intellectually suspect. Each anomaly individually can be rationalized away. The healing spring becomes exaggerated folklore, the griffins become misidentified animals, the giants become mythological embellishment, the sealed tribes become religious allegory. But collectively, these dismissals require assuming the manuscript's author was confused, exaggerating, or lying about every unusual detail, while somehow remaining accurate about mundane geography and politics. That combination, accurate basic geography plus consistent errors about specifics, is statistically improbable. Fabricators don't produce texts with that particular profile. Their inventions typically fail at basic facts while succeeding at memorable details designed to entertain. The manuscript's pattern is precisely reversed. It succeeds at basic geography and political organization while including elements modern readers consider impossible. This suggests the author was recording a world that was genuinely different from ours, not a world he was inventing. What if these impossibilities aren't impossible at all? What if they document conditions that existed in the medieval period but disappeared before modern historical documentation began? What if the world once contained biological diversity, populations, and geographical features that a later catastrophe eliminated? This interpretation requires accepting that the medieval world was stranger and more varied than contemporary science allows. But it resolves the manuscript's internal contradictions more elegantly than assuming systematic fabrication while maintaining geographical accuracy. Examined in isolation, the manuscript's unusual claims seem disconnected, a collection of medieval oddities with no unifying explanation. But when we map these elements onto medieval cartography and compare them with other historical sources, unexpected patterns emerge. Consider medieval maps predating extensive European exploration of Asia. These maps consistently depict a massive region labeled Tartaria or similar variants, stretching across northern Asia from Eastern Europe to the Pacific. This wasn't a minor geographical feature. Cartographers gave it tremendous prominence, often dominating the Asian continent on their representations. The extent of this labeled territory roughly corresponds to what the manuscript describes when referencing the Tartarian Empire. The maps place Cathay within this larger territorial designation, matching the manuscript's claim that Cathay was the central province of Greater Tartaria, rather than an independent nation. Furthermore, the maps typically show Cathay and China as distinct territories with defined borders. This cartographical distinction persisted across different map-making traditions for centuries. Only later did cartographers begin merging these territories under single labels, treating the previous distinction as error requiring correction. But if multiple independent sources, both textual and cartographic, maintain this distinction, the later correction becomes suspect. Who decided these were errors? On what evidence? The revision appears to flow from later assumptions about Asian political organization rather than from discovery of previous mistakes. The economic details provide another connection point. The manuscript's description of a leather-based currency initially seems fantastical, but research into Mongol administrative practices reveals that treated leather actually was used as standardized exchange in certain contexts. This wasn't pure invention. The system existed, documented in sources beyond just this manuscript.
Similarly, accounts of Asian palaces with extensive gold decoration appear in multiple medieval travel accounts. Marco Polo described golden halls without treating them as impossibilities. Other travelers noted similar architectural extravagance. When multiple independent observers report consistent details, dismissing all of them as collective fantasy becomes difficult to justify. The biological anomalies show interesting patterns, too. Griffin-like creatures appear in artwork across diverse cultures: Persian, Greek, Egyptian, Central Asian. The remarkable consistency of these depictions suggests either universal mythological archetypes or observation of actual animals that later went extinct. Large predatory birds beyond modern scales have been documented in fossil records. The Haast's eagle of New Zealand could take down prey much larger than itself. Teratorns in North America had wingspans exceeding 20 feet. While not quite matching manuscript descriptions, these extinct species demonstrate that substantially larger predatory birds did exist in relatively recent prehistory. Giant humans present a more controversial connection. Skeletal remains of unusual size have been discovered and documented, though mainstream archaeology typically interprets these as individual anomalies rather than evidence of distinct populations. However, the sheer number of such findings across continents, combined with the global prevalence of giant legends, creates a pattern difficult to dismiss entirely. The sealed population's perhaps most intriguing connection. Multiple historical sources reference Central Asian peoples in enforced isolation. The geographical location described in various accounts clusters around the same region, mountains near the Caspian Sea. While the dramatic story of mountains closing miraculously may be embellishment, the core claim of isolated populations in that region has surprised